Welcome to the Center in the City podcast. I'm your host, Wade Brill, and during this series, I'll be interviewing various thought leaders, wellness experts, and humans on how they practice sustainable self-care and mindfulness. We'll get real and raw, talk about the light and the shadow side of self-care and mindfulness, and how we can actually stay centered amid the chaos and the hustle and bustle of our modern day world. So settle in and get centered. This podcast episode is brought to you by Centered in the City, a virtual on-demand self-care and mindfulness platform with different meditations, journaling prompts, nourishing recipes, and Pilates flows, all designed to support you feeling calm, focused, and energized as you live your life in this modern day world. For more information, head on over to centeredinthecity.com and claim your 7-day free trial. Welcome back to the Centered in the City podcast. I am so glad you are here. Today on the podcast, I get to interview Seth Lorinczi, who is a writer and an expert in exploring Jewish ancestral trauma. Seth recently is releasing his book this month called Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir. We go deep in our conversation today exploring both of our ancestral trauma. Seth discusses this wake-up call he had at midlife to connect to his purpose in self, purpose in his marriage. We talk about what it means to be a parent and the responsibilities to clear up ancestral trauma and not pass it down to our children, as well as what it's like to be a caregiver to your parent at the end of life. There's so much heart and meaning in everything that Seth and I discussed today that I can't wait for you to listen to today. Before we get into today's episode, I want to share with you a really exciting opportunity. It's the Solstice Silent Meditation Retreat happening this June 21st to the 23rd on the beautiful Whidbey Island in the Pacific Northwest. This retreat is intentionally designed to create a luxurious experience for you to step away from the busyness and the doing of your everyday life so that you can untangle from the noise and connect to your own inner wisdom. You will leave this retreat creating so much more clarity and insight, feeling more empowered by connecting to your body, feeling connected to a group of like-minded people, and feeling way more centered. There are limited spots available, so if your heart and body and mind and soul are craving for some space to be and feel and connect to your own wisdom, I welcome you to head on over to centeredinthecity.com and check out more information for the Solstice Silent Retreat and apply today. Applications close May 10th. Now let's get ready to settle into this episode and let's get centered. Well, welcome to the Centered in the City podcast, Seth.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Love to hear what being centered means to you.
Oh boy. It's funny. I was trying to write about this actually earlier today. You and I chatted about the notion of ancestral trauma a second ago. And it's, to the best of my knowledge, it's impossible to say, well, my ancestors experienced this happening in 1944 or 1923 or whatever. And that's why I feel this way today. I mean, it's not a one-to-one relationship. But for me, the act of centering is recognizing, I call them the wires and the pulleys. And what I mean by that is when I feel my body reacting a certain way, uh, listeners can't see this, but I'm sort of moving my arm up and down as though I'm a marionette. It's these unseen inputs that sort of jerk me into habit and pattern, and they color my vision. And, it's taken a lifetime, and I think it will take the remainder of my lifetime to see those wires and pulleys or the red lenses, the things that are clouding our vision without us knowing it.
I love the visual of a marionette and the pulleys. And it's so true of like what takes us off center, what takes us out of ourselves.
Or even who are we? Who are ourselves? I mean, it's so difficult to pull over and get meaningful perspective on the things you just do as a matter of course. I do this because this is the kind of person I am. I walk through the world in this body, and this is how I react. Is that true? I think for me, I mean, the process of writing the book that we'll be talking about in part was recognizing that there were perspectives and worldviews that I was handed at my birth without my being aware of them. And again, my work is to recognize them and hopefully, in some small way, point out for others these things are not set in stone. We are not the stories that we tell about ourselves. It's always changing, and we have the ability and the means to pop our head above and do things differently and do things in a more meaningful and connective and loving way than I think many of us currently are.
Oh, yes, we will get into the stories we
We will
tell
get into that.
ourselves because that is very juicy to explore. What sparked your path to introspection and to exploring your identity and the conditionings that you were handed?
So what sparked it is that my life was no longer working. I was in my mid 40s. I was married. I had a young daughter, um, but nothing was working. I felt distant and disconnected from my family. My professional life was kind of a sham. Um, I wasn't doing anything meaningful, and I wasn't having the kind of success that I wanted. Um, and I was really at the edge, and I didn't, I was so clueless that I didn't know there was a possibility of a different way. And what happened for me and my family was that my wife and I were actually on the verge of divorce. We were in active conversation with a therapist to separate in a way that was respectful and as gentle as possible on our young daughter. And after a couple of sessions that were, more or less standard marriage counseling, the therapist asked quite innocently, "Would you like to try a session under MDMA?" And having nothing left to lose at that point, we said, okay.
Like, I want to hear more. So tell what from that, what unfolded?
So I paused because, I could go on. And
You had me at my edge of my seat.
well, what comes next is just for a few, and I use this word advisedly, for a few holy hours, we recognized that the stories we'd been telling about ourselves and about each other were just that. They were stories. They were not written in stone. And I realized there was so much more to the story that I had been pushing underground, that I had been trying to push away and not engage with. And that led to the rewriting of my wife and I as partners. We are still married. And it led to the rewriting of ourselves as individuals too. We had to really individuate and follow our own paths and find out what we were here for. Also, I want to say this, and it's funny, I feel emotion saying this. Even though we came together as people who were, I'd say largely, at least on my own part, largely clueless and unconscious, what we recognized in that first session was that we had a really deep contract with each other. We were not together by accident. We had business with each other. And that's a feeling that persists to this day. Uh, and I'm so grateful we were given the opportunity to look in a different way. The last thing I'll say about that is that in my case, what it alerted me to was that there was this vast storehouse of information about my family, about where I'd come from, the people who raised me, and their life experiences that I had no access to, no clue about. And I realized that, again, back to the wires and pulleys, they were directing my life, like in a very real way, and I was not living the life I wanted.
Thank you for sharing a big brushstroke of that story. My heart just expanded hearing that, not only hearing and feeling your deep love for your wife, and it sounds like the soul connection you have, this contract you share with each other, but also your willingness to look inwards and to understand the stories, because it's hard work. Like I went through a similar, not through MDMA, but through my own journey of recognizing how delusional I'd been in the stories that I'd been living and
Mm.
the things I'd been telling myself about my relationship or about myself. And it happened about a little over a year ago and just really opened my eyes to holy shit, like what planet am I living on? And how easily we can get caught in the stories of our mind. And it just can take us in a whole different reality. It's kind of comical when you can step out and see it happening, but when you're in it, it's like really intense.
Again, it's so hard to really pull over from yourself. And I'm thinking of something one of my writing partners said a few years ago. She she tried MDMA in her 30s first. I'm in my 50s right now. And I also want to point out, I'm not suggesting that psychedelics or MDMA are the only vector to this by a long shot. Um, but that happened to be the door that opened. Anyway, my writing partner said until that experience, she literally did not know that she could have an experience that was not shrouded with anxiety. She didn't know that was a possibility in her body. And just the gift of those few hours was so meaningful to her and helped open up all these new pathways for her. Um, but it's hard. I think of something a therapist said that we are, the vast majority of us as adults are really children walking around in adult suits. I'm not saying that to demean anyone. I definitely put myself in that category too. But here's the thing. Once you if you are given and you take the opportunity to pop your head above the clouds of story, you can't unsee it. And in my case, at least, I had to go forward because again, I was not living the life I wanted and I needed to find a pathway to get there.
For those that are listening and they're hearing us talk about stories, how would you describe the stories?
So I think I have a very clear sense of this. I think of growing up in the household. So I am Jewish, but I was raised in large part by Holocaust survivors, by people who were very avoidant of their own story, to the extent that, this is an upper middle class Jewish household. There are literally thousands of books lining the walls, many of them on Jewish history, on the Holocaust, on the experience of trauma and war and dislocation. But because they were so avoidant, they had never grappled with their past. No one ever stopped and said, this is how our story fits into all these. I mean, this is dramatic, but I look back now and I feel as though I grew up in a house of tombstones. And all those tombstones were these books with all these stories of the dead encased in them. So in my case, I got a story of who we were, but really I got the anti-story. Like, this is not who we are. But it's clear there was something missing. Like, there was something I wasn't being told about my family's experiences and their origins. Um, that's not really answering your question. It's sort of answering the inverse of it, but I think it's a significant part. I'll say this. Your real question was, where do those stories about who we are come from? Think back in childhood to overhearing your parents or your grandparents talk to their peers about you, right? They're describing you to other people and you're forming your identity in part through these overheard conversations. Or it's simply how they react towards you. Um, are they warm? Are they attuning to you and your emotional needs? Are they dysregulated? Are they avoidant? All these things tell us our place in the world, and they help build up these skins that we need to survive the world, but at the end of the day, often don't serve us in the long run, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I want to circle back to what you shared around the the stories that you noticed, the untold stories that you
Hmm.
noticed growing up. But before I go there, how I connect to just the stories in my mind is thinking about the literal like meaning making and shit that my mind makes up around not only myself but around other people. So it's judgments, it's assumptions, it's taking, a look from somebody and letting the mind run off and think, oh, they're mad at me because I did X, Y, and Z, right? It's just these meaning making.
I would say not because you did something, but because you are something.
Sure, but my mind is making up that I did,
But that's what I'm saying. I mean, so someone gave an example to me recently that I really loved. It was so simple. Um, you're in your car, you're behind the wheel, you're in traffic, it's frustrating. You get cut off by someone. Your judgment of them is that they are a bad driver. Later, when you accidentally cut someone off because you're being careless and that person honks or gestures at you, it's because you made a mistake. It's not because you're a bad person. You made a mistake. That other person is a bad person. They are a bad driver. That's a projection that our mind tends to make. Whereas when we do something wrong, well, it's just a mistake. I'm not really that way. I'm not really careless.
Interesting. I mean, I think the mind can go both ways. It can, of course, attach the self to it and identify, like, oh, I am this kind of person, or I did something, therefore I am a bad
Right.
person, depending on how far down the rabbit hole the mind goes in that moment. I had this very interesting experience about 2 months ago where I was feeling these deep, intense emotions. I was trying to go to bed, and my partner and I had just had an argument, and all of that kind of gunk from the argument was lingering in my body. And I noticed as I was lying there, I was just making stories up based on the emotions in my body. I was able to see that, like I caught it because I felt myself so
Mhm.
trapped. And I was like, if I choose to just not believe the story, this emotion totally softens and goes away. I was like, I have a choice here, and it's not from a place of like, don't trust my emotions, but it was just this clear, like, wow, I'm choosing that my partner is doing X, Y, and Z and stirring the pot. And I realized, oh, wait, but what if he's not? What if he actually did this because, he cares? And I was like, oh, but then I can kind of soften this, but this still means I'm hurt. Okay, can I meet my hurt myself? The huge felt sense of detangling from the stories of the mind and how much freedom there is when we can catch that. I want to just highlight that for people who are listening and they're like, what are they talking about when they're talking about
Right, right.
stories in the mind?
And one thing I'd say about that, one of the greatest gifts of the last few years, and again, psychedelics not being the only vector at all, but being a powerful and, in my experience, a very fast way to see these in a very stark way. I was raised to be cerebral. My family placed absolutely no value on physical activity. Our bodies were basically a problem. We're really just brains being carted around. And it was really only the last few years in which I realized that I didn't have to believe my thoughts, that my thoughts had been ruling everything, like cerebrality and logic and reason and rationality were everything. And when I understood that, no, I'm not my thoughts and they're not trustworthy, um, that was a real door opening for me too, and just a different way to meet the world.
You're not alone in that. Like we are all so trained, right? Even in school, we're just constantly growing our brains. And yes, there's gym class that's supposed to train us to get into our
Mhm.
bodies, but it hardly does that for most of us. And and it takes a lot of work to untangle from the mind and to find other modalities of wisdom that give us more insight, that's trusting, that's clear. Circling back to what you were sharing around exploring your family story, how did you start to see the stories as a 40 something year old that you've been living, your whole life? How did you start to see and process like what started to become clear to you? Because that feels like that's big. That's a lot of like information to decode.
It was, and I was very lucky in that I had something of a data trail around the time that my marriage was going downhill and it seemed like my life was just falling apart. I rediscovered my father's memoirs. Memoirs is maybe exaggerated. It was about 20 pages about his early life in Hungary that I had seriously browbeaten him to even put to paper a few years before he died, and he's been gone 26 years now. It's quite a while. And I had literally forgotten that these existed at all. But in this time of crisis, I recognized, oh, there's a way to look back at experience, and maybe there's information for me here. So I started there. And the striking thing about rereading his recollections was that I couldn't trust them. I realized that there was so much he was saying, there was so much he was hiding. There was so much he would not put down to paper, so much that he could not face. And near the end, he says as much. He confesses that he spent his entire life, and remember, he's writing this as a, roughly 64, 65-year-old. He says that in all the years since he was a teenager, he has not done the work of turning to face what he lived through as a young person and what our family lived through. And so as I recognized that there was a story there
Mm.
that was a clue to me and maybe was a larger story for others, I had to go as deep as I could. And that meant researching the times and the place, Hungary around the turn of the 20th century through the Second World War, reconnecting with long lost relatives. And of course, these recollections are decades old at this point. Like, you know, they're not they're not necessarily trustworthy either. I'm sort of triangulating. And eventually it took me back to Hungary. I mean, I realized I had to go and I had to find out exactly what happened to them to the best of my ability. And that's what I did. I mean, the book is really, someone compared it to a crime novel, which I actually took as a huge compliment because it really is a detective story.
And by book, we're referring to your book that's coming out this May called Death Trip.
That's right. That's right. Full title, Death Trip, a post-Holocaust psychedelic memoir, just in
Yeah.
case anyone needs to be specific about that.
When you started to connect the pieces and create kind of a new story,
Hmm.
how did that affect your well being and even your marriage?
Mm. So I listened to your conversation with Ben Cat. I have to say, really struck me. I loved listening to it for one. I'm fascinated by his story, but he invokes Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And that's very much what this felt like. And in fact, the book is structured as a hero's journey. I mean, there's this sort of very set unfolding that happens. It was really going into a cave of the unknown and going on a quest. It was necessary for the marriage. As I said earlier, we really had to individuate and find our centers and our purposes and what are we doing here? Because if we can't center ourselves, we have no place in this marriage. So that was mandatory. For me, there's this is something I'm still trying to put a pin in exactly, but there was something about recognizing that we had a backstory and that the people I had known and loved, I'm thinking of my father, my aunt, and my grandparents, had lived through these truly epical times. I mean, experiences that it kind of beggars the imagination. Uh, the Holocaust, the Battle of Budapest. Uh, my grandfather fought in the First World War. Waves of the flu pandemic, mass starvation, mass violence in Central Europe. Really, really unsettling time. And I never even stopped to consider this. And I reckon I wrote something the other day about it's like stepping into your own mythology. And I'm not, I don't believe my personal story is of interest, but there's something powerful at recognizing that these people that I'm related to have this role to play where they lived out these sort of grand experiences. And again, that there's a story there that might be of use to others too.
Yeah, I mean, as you're sharing, my heart is aching because I too am Jewish, and my grandparents, they escaped the Holocaust. They were in Dachau when it was still a work camp. And I'm first generation on my dad's side.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a German passport because of reparations that Germany has made to Jewish families that were forced out of Germany because of the war. And it's heavy, and
Yeah.
it's complicated to hold this passport and feel the gift of it, and also all of the pain that has been explored through the generations to give me this opportunity to have dual citizenship. And epigenetics around trauma and passed down trauma is so interesting. I did a workshop. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Peter Levine, who does
Mm-hmm.
a lot of work around somatic experiencing and generational trauma. And we did this exercise around like talking to a grandparent and trying to draw what they were trying to express to us, and
Fascinating.
to communicate with them in a different form, not through words, right? But through a felt sense. And I think sometimes we forget, we hold, as you share, like stories from the past, from our lineage. Like as a parent, how do you feel like it's your responsibility to kind of like clean up your side of the street? Or I don't even know if that feels like correct terminology, but like
Oh, that's
be,
great.
but be mindful of what you're passing down
Mm.
to your daughter.
Phew. That is tough, I have to say, because I am like many people I don't know, of my upbringing, I suppose, or maybe just personal. I'm a perfectionist. Uh, and I feel like I can trace fairly explicitly where that came from. I think about my own father, and he never said this to me, but he said it to an older relative decades ago about perfectionism. He said, "You have to understand that when I was living in Budapest as a teenager during the German occupation, I had forged papers. If anyone looked at them closely, or if I took a wrong turn and went down this street instead of the other where there was a checkpoint, it was all over. So there was no room for a lack of perfectionism. You have to do it perfectly." And I think about how that's impacted me and how it's impacted my daughter. It's uncomfortable saying this because as much as I wish I had cleaned up that that side of the street, as you say, I haven't. I still I'm still me. I'm still anxious. I'm still controlling. I'm probably neurotic by most people's estimation. And every moment I'm with her, my kid is 16 on the verge of 17 now. I'm watching myself and trying to slow down the reel of film. And when it's tempting to step in with a correction or even a piece of friendly advice, which is actually just perfectionism under another guise, again, it's a real effort to slow down the reel, just let it go. It's okay. She's okay. She'll find her own way. Uh, Honestly, it's day to day. Still, that's part of the work of my life.
Thank you for sharing that. And I know a lot of my listeners, including myself, can relate to the perfectionism. And what a gift to just even acknowledge that that's something you're still working on. and constantly observing within your interactions within self and in relationship to your daughter, and just practicing that urge control, because that's huge. That's something that's been coming to me recently, is all life is really impulse control. And yet
Yes.
a lot of us don't have it.
So, something I like to joke that my father almost literally never gave me any advice. Not to say that he didn't care, but that was just not his way. Literally, the only piece of advice I can remember him saying is that if after I turn the shower off, if I stand there in the shower for a minute or two, most of the water will just drip off, and you'll have less to towel off. Thanks, thanks, Dad. That's great. However, one way I'm maybe breaking that chain is I said this to my daughter a couple of years ago after recognizing it myself. I said, "Look, I don't have the secret to life for sure, but here's one thing I know, and I think it will serve you, which is that anytime you can expand your tolerance for discomfort, as in there's some unquieting stimulus that you don't like, that you want to get away from, you want to shut off, you want to feel differently, change the channel, the longer you can stay in that without reacting, even if just a few milliseconds, you're the better for it. Like that is us evolving and changing our capacities in real time. And I don't know how that struck her, but it's something I really live by. Just just slow it down. You don't have to react.
Mm, I love that advice. Yeah, can we stay with that discomfort and just surf that uncomfortable feeling of
Very
tension that can come
uncomfortable.
up and expand us? And then you're right, there is a sense of like, oof, I did that afterwards. And
Well,
when we can surf it, we can get to the
when we
other
can
side.
surf it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's moment to moment. But I think about what you said earlier about having an argument and sort of watching your thoughts evolve and recognizing that maybe many or most of them are even projections too. And that's all it is, right? Staying in that discomfort, not reacting to it, and changing the way we relate to ourselves and each other. I mean, you said that a second ago, and I don't think there's a simpler, more elegant way of putting it. I believe that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned something that around perfectionism and your conditioning, and how you notice that came from your father, of safety, literally life and death.
Yeah.
And what came up for me as you shared that, something that I've been writing on, and I also have kind of a secret Substack that I've been doing some writing on,
Oh, cool.
and has been around my own operating system, and this idea that I've needed to control everything. And when we navigate uncertainty as a cancer survivor and losing my mom, and the shitstorm that I've been through, and a lot of the loss, uncertainty doesn't scare me. At least I say that. However, because I've told myself and taught myself that I can control the controllables, right? I control what I feed myself and how I move my body and the words I say to myself and how I spend my time, and all these things that give me that false sense of security and control. And yet at the same time, there's control in it. And I recognize that that comes from a place of safety. Like, if I can control, then nothing bad can happen to me. And as
Right.
you shared that, that's a patterning that I thought I developed just because of the shitstorm that I've experienced. But I bet you there's some deep rooted Jewish trauma, ancestral trauma, in that place of control that is really conditioned into me. And I just wanted to call that, if there are other Jewish listeners out there that feel that, or somebody else who's just notices that they're a controller. And I used to kind of joke it off like, yeah, I'm just a controlling person. But I've recently been looking at this pattern and really trying to soften the grip. And it is opening my eyes to actually how, when I release control, how much more trust is possible and how much less anxiety I'm actually having.
Yes. Yes. Control is not the absence of anxiety. It's actually the tightening of it. It's the verification of it. Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. The other day I was talking to someone about my experience of what I imagine intergenerational trauma feels like. Because again, there's no one-to-one. I can't say, well, this happened in 1944 and now I feel this way today. But I describe it as this very faint drum beat that's sort of behind my senses that I don't, in these moments of quietness, when I, again, slow that reel down, I can see, I don't think this is how I need to react to this situation. I think there's something extra on the neurochemical level, on the epigenetic level, however you want to phrase it, that's animating this. And when I can see that and understand, it doesn't take the anxiety away, but I recognize that it's not the whole of the story, not the totality of it for sure.
I'm curious, are you originally from the Pacific Northwest?
No, it's funny. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, like Ben Cat, I noticed, but I grew up in Washington, D.C. My family moved there when I was 3, and I spent 20, I don't know, 20 odd years there. I call DC home, but although I've been on the West Coast for years and years now.
Okay, so I'm also an East Coast Jew
Hmm.
and living on the West Coast. And I'm curious, how do you notice communication, like patterns of communication and conditioning from maybe how you're raised or the stories or cultural and how that affects how you communicate in the Pacific Northwest, whether it's in your own family system or whether it's outside?
Well, I don't know if I'm sharp enough to distinguish my own personal idiosyncrasies from a cultural one. And again, I was raised in an avoidantly Jewish family. But I think there is a brittle veneer of cynicism and irony and emotional distance and fast talking, sometimes literally, that can be jarring. The West Coast is different. I mean, that's just a fact. And I find sometimes that it's a reminder that I don't exactly fit in, which is maybe a lifelong story too, going back to, everything we've been discussing. I know that exactly answers your question, but I do notice these sort of micro differences.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you just sharing that because it's something I've just been observing. And I feel like their Jewish culture is not as prevalent in Seattle as it is in New York City. I'll just say that. And so
I've heard.
it's very interesting to just kind of notice how um yeah, how it shows up and how it's expressed and talked about and contrasted and yeah, what feels familiar and what feels different and what's cultural and what's just like different states cultural and
I also feel like, especially as a young person, you don't know the limits of the world. You don't know how your world has been constructed for you by your family. So there's one scene in the book, the last third takes place in Hungary, and for 1 week, my sister actually came and joined me there, which is incredible, just the trip of our lives. But we're sitting at dinner and we're talking about our childhoods, and my point is that our father represented himself very differently to each of us. She's 2.5 years younger than I am. And we have these totally different narratives about who we are and our place in the world. And she says, well, it's funny. I grew up just thinking that 50% of the world was Jewish. I said, well, does that tell you anything? That maybe our world was very carefully constructed without our knowing. And of course, again, that's what parents do. They create their children's world. But maybe that's not the way everyone around us sees the world, and that's not how they interact and move through it.
mm, yeah, I love that reminder. As you get ready to publish this book and share it with the world, I'm curious, has this helped heal your own personal relationship with your father and your history?
So the process of writing the book very much did. And I have to say this, when my father, I took care of my father at the end of his life, which was the deepest honor to me. We had nothing left to hash out or work out. I was just there to serve him. And it was, again, it was an honor. As the years went by, though, and I recognized the ways in which he had not been able to, or even attempted, I think, to face what he had lived through and what that had passed on to me, my feelings got more complicated for sure. Um, I actually just published an essay in it, it's a publication called The Keep Things. It's actually on Substack and on Instagram. It started on Instagram. I cannot recommend it enough. It's an image of an object that someone now dead owned that you can't get rid of. And they're very short essays. They're just 600 words or so. And I published one recently about an object of my father's. And when we were done with the editing process, the editor said, was surprised that I expressed reverence for my father. Because based on what I'd written, she'd gotten the anger and the disappointment and the ambivalence. And as a writer, and I'd say as a human being, it's my job to hold ambivalence. And I mean ambivalence in the truest sense, not caring, but being able to hold the both and. Because it's all true. My father was not able to be there for me in a way in which I really hoped he had. And he was not able to face his past. And he was also the best father he could be. So I feel warmly and sometimes complicatedly.
And I appreciate you sharing that because I think all of us can relate to that, especially as we get older. We realize our parents aren't these superhuman heroes that we want them to be and think they are when we're younger. With that, I'd love to hear as we wrap up if you have one piece of advice for people who are maybe saying goodbye to their parents in their final stages. Like, what are some things that you really recommend asking them or doing with them to offer just even a little bit of healing?
That's so big and so complicated, but the thing that immediately comes to mind is we talked a minute ago about the idea of expanding your tolerance for discomfort. There will be discomforts with your parents. There will be unresolved hurts and misunderstandings. It's hard to explain how final that is. You know, if you haven't lost parents, and I know you have, um, how total that is, and how much having information later will serve you, how much of a gift it will be to you and to those who follow you. So practice that. Practice that expansion of tolerance for discomfort. Ask everything, even especially the most uncomfortable things. Ask it all because it's a gift both to you in having this information later, and I would be willing to bet good money, a gift to them as well to be able to unburden themselves.
Oof, thank you, Seth, for that. Like, I feel like this conversation, I know we went way over, but felt so nourishing for my soul and for talking about all these really important aspects of living that we don't typically make space for in our life. Seth, where can people learn more about you and find out how they can order your book, Death Trip?
Thank you. So I'm laughing because I have a website under my own name, but of course no one can spell it. SethLorinczi.com. I challenge you. You'll link it in the show notes, I know. Um, the publisher is easier. It's called Spiral Press Collective, one word. And if you go to that website, spiralpresscollective.com, you'll find a pre-order link to the book, which comes out in May. I also have a Substack. If you go to Substack and search either my name or The Bottom of the Ocean, which is the name of my publication. Yeah.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for being here and thank you for sharing your wisdom and congratulations on writing and getting your book out there in the world.
Thank you so much. I really love talking with you. I appreciate the questions and the conversation so much.
Thanks so much for listening to the Center in the City podcast. I welcome you to take a moment and pause and let whatever spoke to your heart and soul and mind just simmer for a moment. We can so easily get in the habit when we listen to podcasts of just digesting, letting things go in one ear and out the other, but really take this moment to just savor and notice what resonated for you, what sparked more curiosity, what emotions were evoked inside of you. If you feel inspired, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to share with me your takeaways by joining me on Instagram at OneWade or sending me a message through the link in the show notes, as well as buy Seth's book, which you can find out more information in the show notes with the link. It comes out May 21st. Until next time, stay centered.